Hawaii is the most remote island chain on Earth, sitting roughly 2,400 miles from the nearest continental landmass. Further from any other population center than almost anywhere else people permanently live. But within that already isolated chain of islands, a smaller number of communities exist that are cut off even from the rest of Hawaii itself, separated not by ocean alone, but by lava fields, sheer cliffs, century-old private property laws, and in one case a public health quarantine that outlasted the disease it was designed to contain by decades. This video counts down 9 real Hawaii communities defined by genuine isolation, documented in National Park Service records, county planning reports, and Native Hawaiian cultural resource studies. Several are physically difficult to reach under the best circumstances. More than one comes with an explicit, publicly stated request from the people who live there: please do not visit without an invitation. Stay with me to the end, because the final island on this list has been closed to outside visitors for more than 150 years, is owned outright by a single family, and carries an official nickname that says everything you need to know about how welcome you are there, the Forbidden Island. Let's begin. Milolii, on the remote southwest coast of the Big Island, holds a distinction that has become increasingly rare across the Hawaiian Islands. It remains one of the last traditional Hawaiian fishing villages, still operating largely as it has for generations. Its small community sustained by ocean fishing practices, including the traditional aku, or skipjack tuna, fishery that has been central to the village's identity and subsistence economy for well over a century. The village sits at the end of a narrow, winding road far from the resort development and tourist infrastructure that defines much of the rest of the Big Island's coastline, a physical isolation that residents have actively worked to preserve rather than see eroded by outside development pressure. Milolii's community has organized for years around cultural and environmental preservation efforts, including active participation in managing a community-based subsistence fishing area established specifically to protect the near-shore waters that the village's fishing traditions depend on, a designation that comes with specific rules about harvesting that apply to residents and visitors alike. Milolii is not formally closed to outside visitors, but its infrastructure, culture, and daily rhythms remain built entirely around a small, tightly connected fishing community rather than tourism, with no hotels, few services, and a local population that has been notably vocal in county planning discussions about resisting the kind of development that has transformed so many other coastal Hawaiian communities. It stands today as a rare, still-functioning window into a way of life that development pressure has erased almost everywhere else in the islands. In the Puna district on the eastern side of the Big Island, the 2018 eruption of Kilauea volcano permanently and dramatically altered the map, destroying more than 700 homes and burying entire subdivisions under lava flows that, in some places, reached more than 80 feet thick. The communities of Kapoho and Vacationland, both built on the coast near a scenic tide pool area that had drawn residents specifically for its natural beauty, were almost completely destroyed, their streets and neighborhoods entombed under fresh black rock that, years later, remains too unstable and too hot in places for any redevelopment. The eruption forced the evacuation of thousands of residents across the broader Puna district, and while many neighborhoods outside the direct path of the lava flows were eventually reoccupied, several areas remain officially designated hazard zones by Hawaii County, restricting rebuilding and, in the most severely affected sections, any permanent habitation at all. Leilani Estates, one of the hardest-hit subdivisions, saw dozens of homes destroyed by fissures that opened directly through residential yards and streets, an experience that left many residents dealing with the practical and emotional reality of a volcanic hazard that had, until 2018, existed mostly as an abstract risk rather than a lived catastrophe. Today, sections of the Puna lava zone remain eerily accessible by road, allowing visitors to drive to the edge of neighborhoods that simply stop existing where the black rock begins, streets that once had house numbers and mailboxes now leading directly into a solid permanent lava field. Local officials continue to discourage casual sightseeing in the most sensitive areas, both for visitor safety given ongoing volcanic activity in the region, and out of basic respect for a community that lost homes, and in a small number of tragic cases lives, to a disaster that remains recent enough that many residents are still rebuilding their lives around it. Before we go further, it's worth understanding why Hawaii, in particular, produces this specific mix of natural and deliberate isolation, because the two forces are more intertwined here than in almost any other American state. Hawaii's isolation begins with pure geography, a volcanic island chain built by a hotspot in the middle of the Pacific, its individual islands separated from each other by open ocean, and within each island, frequently divided by steep valleys, sheer sea cliffs, and active lava flows that have made significant stretches of Hawaiian coastline essentially impossible to develop, or in some cases, even reach by road. This raw physical isolation is compounded by a genuinely unique history of land ownership and public health policy found nowhere else in the United States. 19th-century royal land grants that placed entire islands into private hands that remain unchanged to this day, and a public health quarantine system established to isolate Hansen's disease patients that operated with the force of law for the better part of a century. Layered on top of both of these is a growing, well-documented pattern of Native Hawaiian communities and cultural sites actively asserting boundaries around outside visitation. Not from hostility, but from a documented history of tourism development, resource extraction, and cultural appropriation that many communities argue has already taken more from Hawaii than it has given back. Hawaii's most isolated towns, in other words, are shaped by volcanic geography, unusual property law, historical public health policy, and a contemporary movement toward protecting what outside pressure has not already changed. Four forces that, unlike almost anywhere else in the country, frequently overlap in the exact same physical locations. Waipio Valley, on the northeastern coast of the Big Island, is often described as one of the most spectacular valleys in all of Hawaii. A mile-wide, 6-mile-deep gorge carved between sheer cliffs that rise as much as 2,000 feet, with a black sand beach, waterfalls, and taro fields, still cultivated using traditional Hawaiian agricultural methods at its floor. The valley was historically one of the most significant population and political centers in ancient Hawaii, home to the residences of high chiefs, and considered by many Native Hawaiians to be a place of profound spiritual and cultural significance. Access to the valley floor has always been physically demanding, requiring a descent down one of the steepest paved roads in the entire United States, a grade so severe that rental car companies typically prohibit their vehicles from attempting it at all. In recent years, the small community of residents and taro farmers still living and working in the valley grew increasingly vocal about the impact of unchecked tourist traffic, citing damage to sensitive agricultural land, safety hazards on the narrow access road, and basic disruption to a community that had never asked to become a mass tourism destination. That pressure led Hawaii County to implement a formal permit system restricting general public vehicle access to the valley floor, a policy explicitly framed around protecting both visitor safety and the rights of the Native Hawaiian families who continue to live and farm there. Waipio today represents one of the clearest, most recent examples in the state of a community successfully asserting control over its own accessibility, transforming what had become an overwhelmed tourist attraction back into something closer to what it had been for centuries, a working valley managed on its residents' own terms. If you're finding this hidden side of Hawaii as fascinating as we are, we'd really appreciate it if you hit that like button and consider subscribing. It helps us keep making videos like this one. Now, let's keep going. Roughly 1,200 miles northwest of the main Hawaiian Islands, the Papahānaumokuākea Marine National Monument encompasses one of the largest protected areas on Earth, a vast stretch of ocean and low-lying islands and atolls that includes some of the most ecologically pristine and culturally significant sites in the entire Pacific. Several of the monument's islands, including Nihoa and Mokumanamana, also known as Necker Island, hold profound spiritual significance in Native Hawaiian tradition, containing ancient religious sites and considered by many Native Hawaiians to be a sacred realm connecting the living world to the ancestral gods. Access to nearly the entire monument is governed by one of the strictest permit systems applied to any protected area in the United States, jointly managed by federal agencies, the State of Hawaii, and the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, reflecting a co-management structure that explicitly incorporates Native Hawaiian cultural authority alongside conventional environmental protection. Even scientific researchers must obtain specific permits and are frequently required to undergo cultural protocols before landing on the monument's most sacred islands, a level of access restriction that treats the sites not merely as ecologically sensitive, but as actively spiritually significant places requiring the same kind of respect one might extend to a place of worship. For virtually all members of the public, Papahānaumokuākea is not a place you can simply decide to visit. There is no tourist infrastructure, no scheduled transportation, and no path to access beyond a small number of tightly controlled research and cultural expeditions each year. It represents in effect the most thoroughly closed landscape in the entire Hawaiian archipelago, protected simultaneously by federal conservation law and by a living Native Hawaiian spiritual tradition that predates any of the modern regulatory language now used to describe it. On the remote Kalaupapa Peninsula on the north shore of Molokai, separated from the rest of the island by some of the tallest sea cliffs on Earth, the settlement of Kalawao holds one of the most difficult histories of any place in the United States. Beginning in 1866, the Kingdom of Hawaii, following patterns established by public health authorities elsewhere in the world, began forcibly exiling people diagnosed with Hansen's disease, then known as leprosy, to the peninsula, isolating them from their families and communities based on a level of medical understanding about the disease's actual transmissibility that later science would prove significantly overstated. Kalawao served as the initial forced settlement site before residents were later relocated to Kalaupapa on the peninsula's more sheltered side, and the site remains associated above all with Father Damien, a Belgian Catholic priest who arrived in 1873 to serve the isolated community and ultimately contracted and died from the disease himself in 1889 after 16 years of continuous service, a story that brought international attention to the settlement's conditions and eventually led to significant improvements in how patients were treated. The forced isolation policy itself continued in some form until 1969, meaning Hawaii operated an enforced medical quarantine colony well into the era of modern antibiotics capable of effectively treating the disease. Kalawao today is largely undeveloped, preserved as a historic site within Kalaupapa National Historical Park, accessible only through the same tightly restricted permit process that governs the rest of the peninsula. Very few visitors ever reach the original settlement site, both because of the peninsula's extreme physical isolation and because access remains deliberately limited out of respect for a place where thousands of people were forcibly confined, many of whom never saw their families again. Kalaupapa itself, the later and larger settlement on the peninsula's northern shore, continued operating as a forced isolation colony for Hansen's disease patients for more than a century. And even after Hawaii's mandatory isolation law was repealed in 1969, a number of patients chose to remain in the only home most of them had known for decades, having been separated from their families as children or young adults and having built entire lives within the settlement's small community. Kalaupapa National Historical Park was established in 1980 specifically to preserve the site while honoring the wishes and privacy of the patient community that continued to live there. Access to Kalaupapa remains among the most restricted of any National Park Service site in the entire country. Visitors must obtain advance permission. No one under the age of 16 is permitted to visit at all, and for years the only ways to physically reach the peninsula were a small aircraft, a boat, or hiking down a steep, switchback trail carved into the sea cliffs, since no road connects Kalaupapa to the rest of Molokai. Tour access has historically been contingent on approval from resident patients themselves, a policy that placed genuine decision-making authority over visitation directly in the hands of the very community whose forced isolation created the site in the first place. The last of Kalaupapa's Hansen's disease patients have passed away in recent years, closing out a living connection to the settlement's darkest history. But the National Park Service has maintained the same fundamental spirit of restricted, respectful access that patients themselves insisted upon for decades, a place where the difficulty of visiting is not an accident of geography, but a deliberate, honored choice made by the people who were forced to live there. Hana, on the remote eastern coast of Maui, is technically connected to the rest of the island by road, but the road to Hana itself has become so notorious for its difficulty that the destination and the journey have become functionally inseparable in the minds of most visitors. More than 600 curves and dozens of narrow one-lane bridges wind along approximately 52 miles of coastal cliffside highway, a drive that can easily take 3 or 4 hours each way, even before accounting for the inevitable traffic created by tourists stopping at waterfalls along the route. That extreme physical isolation has allowed Hana to retain a distinctly different character from the resort-heavy west and south coasts of Maui, remaining home to one of the highest concentrations of Native Hawaiian residents of any town in the state, and maintaining agricultural and cultural traditions that development pressure has significantly eroded elsewhere on the island. Local residents and community organizations have been outspoken for years about the strain that growing tourist traffic places on Hana's limited infrastructure, its narrow roads, and a community that, despite its fame as a scenic destination, has comparatively few resources of its own to manage the volume of visitors the drive itself has made into a bucket list attraction. Community groups in Hana have periodically called for greater respect from visitors, including basic requests to stay on public trails, avoid trespassing on private and cultural sites, and recognize that the town is a living community with its own residents and traditions, rather than simply a scenic backdrop for a road trip photo, a tension that has only grown as the road to Hana's fame has continued to draw more visitors than the isolated town at the end of it was ever built to accommodate. Niihau, the westernmost inhabited island in the main Hawaiian chain, has operated under an official policy of near-total exclusion for outside visitors since 1864, when Eliza Sinclair purchased the entire island from King Kamehameha V for $10,000, an arrangement that came with an informal understanding that the island's native Hawaiian residents and their traditional way of life would be protected from outside development. The island has remained in the hands of the same family, now known as the Robinsons, for more than 160 years, making it one of the longest continuously privately held large landmasses anywhere in the United States. The Robinson family's management of Niihau has produced a community unlike anywhere else in Hawaii, or arguably anywhere else in the country. The island has no paved roads, no public electrical grid, no running water infrastructure beyond what residents maintain themselves, and a population numbering somewhere between 70 and 130 people depending on the year that remains the largest concentration of native Hawaiian language speakers anywhere in the state, since Niihau's isolation preserved linguistic and cultural traditions that development pressure eroded almost everywhere else in the islands decades ago. Access to Niihau is not simply discouraged, it is formally prohibited without a direct invitation from a resident or specific permission from the Robinson family, a policy enforced for more than a century and a half that has earned the island its enduring nickname, the Forbidden Island. Limited helicopter tours operate along the island's coastline and occasionally allow brief beach landings in uninhabited areas, but the actual village and its residents remain entirely off-limits to outside visitors, a Hawaiian community that has spent a century and a half deliberately, successfully, and by every account intentionally choosing isolation over access, precisely because its residents decided, from the very beginning, that some things are worth protecting from the outside world entirely. If you've made it this far, thank you for sticking with us through the full story of Hawaii's strangest and most isolated towns. If you found these places as fascinating as we did, please consider subscribing. We cover more of America's hidden and remarkable places every week, and we'd love to have you along for the next one.